Sleepy Winks is proud to present the special two-part series of Jack and the Beanstalk, adapted and performed by Zach Connor. Part 2. Time seemed to speed up as Jack climbed the beanstalk. The sun rose and set faster than Jack had ever seen it rise and set before. It felt like weeks to Jack climbing the beanstalk. Finally, Jack approached where the beanstalk disappeared into the clouds. He took a deep breath and took one more step up. Bang! Went Jack's head against something solid hidden in the clouds. Ouch! Jack exclaimed, rubbing a growing bump on his head. Jack looked up to see what he had hit his head on, and saw a large white door laying down flat amongst the clouds. Jack reached for the handle and slowly turned it. As the door began to swing up, it creaked loudly like it had not been opened for a very long time, and landed with a loud thud as it fell uncontrolled to the other side. Jack peeked his head through the opening. His eyes grew wide and he gasped loudly at the sight he found hiding in the clouds. It was a castle, but not just any castle. This one was the largest and most beautiful castle Jack had ever seen. It was almost pure white except for a very, very large set of red doors guarding the entrance. There were statues of strange creatures Jack had never seen before guarding each side of the doorway, and as Jack approached the castle, he noticed that it seemed to be shining in the bright sunlight, like the outside was covered in dull jewels. As Jack walked up to the castle in amazement, he got a smell of delicious fresh bread and roasted meat floating in the air. Since Jack had not eaten at all since he left for town to sell his cow, Jack was starving and decided to enter the castle, have a look around, and hopefully find the source of the irresistible smells. Jack came upon the giant red doors and found a crack wide enough to squeeze through. He entered the castle and slowly crept through the entrance hall. The first thing that stood out to Jack was how plain the inside of the castle was compared to the outside. The walls were made of dull gray stone, and no artwork or tapestries were anywhere to be seen. As Jack made his way further into the castle, he found himself in a large dining area. The second thing that Jack noticed about the castle stood out immediately in this room. Everything in the castle was huge. The table stood a good 20 feet high, and the chairs surrounding it were just as big. As Jack climbed up one of the wooden chair's legs and up the back, he found that the forks and knives were bigger than a cow, and the goblets were filled with enough wine they could have filled a swimming pool. Jack was speechless. What on earth would be needing such large things? Surely no one could drink this much wine and use a fork larger than a cow. Just as Jack finished this thought, he felt the chair underneath him begin to vibrate in what seemed like waves. The fork and knives clanged with each vibration, and the wine in the goblets rippled. Jack, feeling alarmed, jumped off the back of the chair onto the table and hid under a fold in one of the giant napkins, which was larger than his entire house. Satisfied he was concealed enough from whatever was causing the large vibrations, which seemed to be getting stronger, Jack waited. Before long, a massive form took shape in the doorway where Jack had entered the dining hall, and Jack immediately realized that the vibrations he had been feeling were from footsteps the footsteps of a giant. The giant paused in the doorway, looked at the table, and roared, causing some of the wine to spill out of the goblets.
"Where's my supper?"
the giant growled. The giant made his way to the opposite end of where Jack was hiding and sat down in the large chair with a heavy thud. As the giant slumped heavily in the chair, all of the forks, knives, spoons, goblets, and to Jack's horror, napkins, bounced high in the air with the weight of the giant sitting down. Jack went into the air along with the napkin and landed hard on the wooden table, now only partially covered up by it. To Jack's relief, it looked as though the giant hadn't noticed the extra guest that had joined him for supper, and Jack slowly crept back under the napkin as the giant drained an entire goblet of wine in one gulp. As the giant wiped the wine from his mouth with his hairy arm, a door on the opposite side of the room opened and a large woman entered pushing a cart full of delicious-looking food. There were meats, whole loaves of bread, entire wheels of cheese larger than any Jack had ever seen. Could this be what the old man was saying? Was he expecting Jack to steal this food to feed himself and his mother? As Jack pondered this, the giant grunted and yelled,
"Bring me my treasure!"
A few moments later, the same woman who had brought the giant his food entered the dining room again, this time pushing a smaller cart. Jack looked in amazement at the cart, and his heart skipped a beat. On the cart were piles and piles of gold, precious gems, jewel-encrusted crowns and swords, and all manner of valuable items. The giant grunted again and reached over to pluck two specific things from his treasure. The first was a small harp. The harp appeared to be made of pure gold and had a beautiful, solid gold woman engraved and attached to the end. The other was a rather ordinary-looking goose, sitting on a nest of hay. The giant gently sat them on the table and stared at them. The goose looked up at the giant and gave a soft honk. The giant poked the harp with his huge finger and grumbled,
"Play."
To Jack's amazement, he saw the engraved woman move on the harp. She stretched two long, elegant arms and turned to look at the giant.
"I'd rather not, if it's all the same to you. I'm quite tired,"
the harp said to the giant. The giant slammed a hairy fist on the table, shaking the entire room, toppling over the harp on its side and causing the goose to honk loudly in disapproval. The harp pushed itself upright as the giant roared,
"It was not a request. Now, play."
Okay,
the harp replied gently.
no need to be rude."
As the giant sat back down and began stuffing his mouth with handfuls of food, the harp began to play. It was the most beautiful music Jack had ever heard. He found himself almost hypnotized by the beautiful melody. As Jack looked on in amazement, he saw the giant's eyes beginning to droop as if he were falling asleep. Before the giant was lulled to sleep by the beautiful music, he gently lifted the goose, and to Jack's surprise, he saw that the goose had laid 5 eggs. Each were the size of a coconut, and each were solid gold. It was at this point Jack knew what he was going to do. Even though the other treasure on the cart would have been more than enough for him and his mother and an entire town to live comfortably on, Jack greedily wanted to ensure he would always have treasure. At this point, the giant began to snore loudly. Jack crept out from under the napkin. He tore a small corner of the fabric away and tied it into a sack to carry the harp. He quietly made his way over to the goose and the harp. They both noticed him approaching and looked nervously up at the snoozing giant. Jack picked up the harp and placed it into the sack. He then made his way over to the goose and tucked it gently under his arm. He turned quickly, crept back to the other side of the table, and began to climb down the same chair he had climbed up earlier. On his way down, the harp began to slip out of his makeshift sack. Jack reached quickly for it, but it was too late. The harp was already falling to the ground. Jack watched in terror as the harp clanged against the stone floor, making a very unusual and very loud sound. Jack heard the giant begin to stir from his slumber right as he reached the floor and replaced the harp in his sack.
My treasures!
The giant screamed.
There is a thief in my castle.
Jack then heard the giant take a very long, deep breath in, and the giant growled,
Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of a greedy little Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread.
As Jack ran as fast as he could hear the giant in the dining hall throwing the table and chairs across the room, searching for him. As Jack reached the front door and squeezed again through the crack, he could hear and feel the boom, boom, boom of the giant's feet hitting the floor as he began to chase after him. Jack kept running as fast as his legs would carry him, back to the hole in the clouds and to the beanstalk. The giant was easily beginning to catch up to Jack.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. Your greed has a stench that I'll never forget. A sneak and a thief thinks he can steal from me? I, the greatest of giants, taller than any tree, stronger than an army, and the fastest in the land. I'll catch you, little thief, and crush you with one hand.
Jack finally reached the door, still lying open among the clouds. He quickly climbed through it and began climbing down as fast as he could. The giant appeared in the hole mere moments after Jack had started descending the beanstalk. He let out a great roar in frustration and began pulling the door away. To Jack's astonishment, the hole began to get bigger and bigger with each chunk the giant removed. Soon the hole was big enough for the giant to fit through, and he began to climb down the beanstalk after Jack. What Jack lacked in size compared to the giant, he made up for in speed and motivation. He quickly caught sight of his home below him and hurried down the last few hundred feet to reach the ground. He could still hear the giant growling and snapping off vines from the beanstalk as he chased Jack down. But Jack could not see him yet, meaning he was still quite a ways up. Jack's mother hurriedly ran outside when Jack reached the ground and began asking him questions. Jack ignored her for the time being, handed her the goose and the sack with the harp, and ran inside the house. He grabbed the axe he used to chop wood with and ran back to the beanstalk. Jack began chopping wildly at the large green trunk. Thankfully, it was a lot softer than wood, so the axe was making quick work of the stalk. When Jack reached the point when he knew only a couple more swings would cause the vine to topple over, he stopped. He waited until he saw the giant to ensure he was still climbing down the beanstalk. When the giant came into view, Jack gave 2 more great swings with the axe. The beanstalk, along with the giant, fell a very, very long ways to the ground. Jack heard one last roar from the giant. Then the ground shook as the beanstalk and the giant hit it with a thunderous crash. After that, there was silence. The giant had been killed. Jack and his mother hugged a very deep and tight hug. Jack retrieved the harp and the goose from his mother and told her, "Mother, all of our problems are solved. You see this harp? It plays the most beautiful music you will ever hear. And when it does, the goose will lay solid gold eggs." From that day on, Jack and his mother never went hungry again, and the giant was soon forgotten, taken over by the force where he fell and never spoken of ever again. The end. We hope you have enjoyed this special 2-part series of Jack and the Beanstalk, brought to you by Sleepy Winks, adapted and performed by Zach Connor. Until next time, thank you from the Sleepy Winks family.